Welcome in. We have a special Locked On NBA Insider Report here on NBA Free Agency Day. I'm your host, Kainani Stevens. Adam Armbrecht from Locked On Nets is joining us because obviously KD dropping a couple hours before free agency that he wants to leave the Nets. Is this a shocker to you as it was to me, or did we kind of see this coming?
I mean, listen, there were some small rumors that the Brooklyn Nets were approaching negotiations with Kyrie Irving around a contract extension with the understanding that they were willing to lose both players if that was the fallout. However, no one anticipated that once Kyrie Irving opted in for this year, it very much felt like, okay, we've bought ourselves a year, or at least at a minimum until the trade deadline, to see what this team can look like. This was a message sent directly from Kevin Durant to owner Joe Tsai. No general manager Sean Marks' involvement here, after zero communication over the last several weeks. So I think that the Nets fan base and the NBA overall is about as shocked at this as anyone, because nobody even had a rumbling that this was coming down the pipeline ahead of free agency.
And obviously, when you have someone of KD's talent plus the deal that he already has in place with Brooklyn, that's not going to be easy to move, right? Like normally when players are requesting a trade, maybe we know where they're going or have an idea. He has floated, I think, a couple teams out there, Phoenix and Miami, but where could we realistically see him ending up at this point?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, the first part is he has 4 years left on his contract at max dollars. This is unprecedented in that regard as well. Teams don't typically just acquiesce to this, which understandably, there's not really a lot of other ways for Brooklyn to go at this point. But when you hear about a team like the Miami Heat, you're not going to be able to get back Bam Adebayo. There's certain restrictions around where his contract stands coming off of his rookie deal, let alone the teams that he's going to go to. They want to win with Kevin Durant, not strip all the assets that they have available in order to acquire him. Phoenix, likewise, a sign and trade with DeAndre Ayton is going to result in different allocation of dollars. Phoenix can send out that money at a 50% rate of what they retain or represent on their books. Brooklyn cannot do that. So lining up the numbers is difficult, and then getting what would be fair compensation, if we can even wrap our heads around that, for a talent like Kevin Durant. Their only baseline is Paul George going from OKC to the Clippers, and that's not close because Kevin Durant is a far better player. No insult to Paul George. If you get a trade done with someone, you're getting back draft capital that will only diminish because that team now has Kevin Durant. So I think potentially getting multiple teams involved here is going to be the most likely scenario that allows the Brooklyn Nets to get back high value draft capital and maybe some young talent, and also get Kevin Durant to a contender that he immediately walks into and makes one of the favorites.
We've also seen some reports out there that Kyrie and KD do still want to play together, just not in Brooklyn. How realistic is that? Because obviously he did opt in, so it kind of seems a little bit like KD's like, oh yeah, I want to play with you, like maybe if that works out. But how realistic would it be for a team to not only be able to get KD, but then also somehow get Kyrie?
Yeah, and then you start to talk about why did it fall apart with Brooklyn and Kyrie Irving? Because they couldn't come to terms on the extension. The discussions after he opted in were that the Brooklyn Nets, among other offers, had a 2-year max dollar deal with the opportunity for years 3 and 4 to kick in based on games played and other incentives at max dollars as well. So it's not as though there weren't significant offers there between the two sides. However, what team can afford to bring them in at the dollar amounts that KD already has and what Kyrie's going to want? And on top of which, again, what are they going to be able to send out to the Brooklyn Nets? Kevin Durant may be saying that behind closed doors. The fallout was obviously clear in Brooklyn. I'll put it this way as well. Look across the NBA landscape. Kevin Durant is still the #1 prize for any team. Any franchise would want to bring him in to be a part of it. If you start hearing that he's demanding or requesting to have Kyrie be a part of it, some teams may at least take a pause here. We have a 3+ year sample size of how bad things can go with these two players on your team.
It's certainly not going to be appealing to a lot of people when you see how good they both are separately and then together not so much. So is this, I mean, obviously you've been talking this out with, for a couple of hours now, but is this worst case scenario, or can they kind of get a king's ransom back? I mean, KD is a huge talent, so you have to imagine if they're completing this trade, they're going to get a lot of stuff back.
Yeah, the two sides of it are, on the one hand, if you get back a package of young talent, depending on what that could look like, a DeAndre Ayton, obviously, young, just scratching the surface of what his prime could be. You still have some young players on your team, Cam Thomas, Kessler Edwards, Daron Sharp. Now, what they are evaluated as without superstars is obviously a different spectrum. I think on the one hand, yes, and there's been reports that Brooklyn wants to try to get a return for Kevin Durant that allows them to stay competitive, thinking that Ben Simmons can be a part of that process. The other side of the coin is Oklahoma City or the Houston Rockets, right? They've been stuck in these cycles of getting a ton of draft capital and occasionally finding a player like SGA. However, they're not competing, right? So all of the assets in the world are only valuable if they turn into production. And as a major market team, as Brooklyn is, or at least wants to entrench themselves as, it's going to be really hard for them to go fully to the basement and try to rebuild this thing again from the ground up, as Sean Marks did when he first took over as GM.
Funny you mention that, because I mean, a lot of those teams that do have the picks maybe that the Nets would want, KD might not want to play there, right? Does he have to approve this deal for the trade to go through?
That's an interesting facet too. Is there any level of cordial communication between either side of this? In the past, as with Spencer Dinwiddie, the Nets wanted to facilitate and get him a contract, ended up with the Wizards, ultimately on his way to Dallas. So the organization has always represented itself as one that wanted to be upfront, clear communication. However, in this situation with Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant, there's obviously animosity there, or you would assume so. I don't see a world where they say, back to Oklahoma City with you, and we'll take back all the capital. I think it behooves the Brooklyn Nets to look at the teams that Kevin Durant may be interested in going to, look at the talent they have there, which all of the competitive or championship caliber teams are going to have valuable young talent, you would think, like in the case of Phoenix, and say, how do we get back players and capital and try to strike that balance so that we can still be a play-in team, a back end of the playoff team? Because that's important from the side of the Brooklyn Nets. They don't want to try to dig out of a 3 or 4 year hole. And in that regard, while it could be an option, I don't see the reason why Brooklyn would want to go down that road.
A lot more to come on this. Obviously, check out Locked On Nets for the podcast, and of course on YouTube as well. Wherever you get your podcast, you can check that out. I'm Kainani Stevens. Thank you for joining us.